Hello and welcome to another video that's going to help you get the top grades. All the information for today's video comes from the examiner's report. So are these actually secrets? Well, partly they are because I'm translating that report to you. And the other reason that they're secret is your teachers often won't have time to look at the reports in lots of detail. I'm lucky that I do. And you can actually find the reports yourselves if you just go to the AQA website, click on subjects and follow the links. You don't have to log in. Anyone can find this stuff out. So let's dive straight in and let me give you the top bits of advice from the examiners. So students explored complicated ideas and emotions when they got high marks in 2017. Well, let me give you some examples of what that might mean. So you might explore the emotion that Macbeth has for Lady Macbeth. So the average student will talk about how he seems to fall out of love with her after the Banquo scene. So after Banquo appears as a ghost at the feast and Lady Macbeth takes over, she emasculates Macbeth by taking over his role. And so she effectively acts as king in this scene because Macbeth seems so fearful of Banquo's ghost. And she has to keep taking charge of him in that scene. And thereafter, he stops confiding in her. They sleep apart. Good readers will also have noticed that actually there's a split in the relationship even before, because Macbeth refuses to tell her that he plans to kill Banquo. He said, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, till thou applaud the deed." In other words, he's going to wait until after Banquo's dead before he tells Lady Macbeth what he's done. And so it's very easy to see the marriage as one in which they stop being in love. Well, that's reasonably complicated, but we can make that much more complicated by suggesting that actually Macbeth has a really powerful, deep love for his wife, and therefore he's trying to protect her. He doesn't want her to suffer mentally as he is suffering. And we can add as further evidence to that the sleepwalking scene where he brings in a doctor to try and help her. So we can actually use the same evidence to show this proves he loves her passionately. And that's where we get to complicated and we get into the top band. Here's another example, their response to the death of their baby. And it's quite easy to overlook this, but Macbeth's delight in killing that we have right at the beginning of the play when he's defending Scotland, when he's still noble and honourable, that kind of savagery we can ascribe to the mourning he's going through that he's just lost his baby. And Lady Macbeth, when she says, "Unsex me here, take my milk for gall," she's reminding us that she's still lactating. She's still a mother. Her body still expects that baby to be there drinking her milk. In other words, the baby has just died. It's really, really recent. And this psychologically has also affected her. There's a big hole in her life, if you like, which is going to be replaced by becoming queen. And further than that, we can infer that it's been really difficult for them to conceive. There are obviously fertility problems here because this is their only child. We know that because of Macduff's reaction when his children are killed. He says that Macbeth has no children. So we know how important this baby must be to both of them. And that could be the root of their hamartia, the weakness that sends them towards ambition to replace this love that they've lost of their child. Another complicated emotion we can deal with is Macduff abandoning his family. Now let's just think about this. Macduff decides that Macbeth is a tyrant, Macbeth is an enemy, and he must defeat Macbeth. So he goes to England to team up with Malcolm, Duncan's son, and he wants to come back leading an army to kill Macbeth. Well, brilliant. But what does he do with his family? He leaves them undefended in his castle in Scotland. I mean, he knows as soon as Macbeth finds out that he's gone off to the English forces that his family are vulnerable. He knows that. He might not expect that they're going to be killed, but they'll certainly be imprisoned. Their castle will be confiscated, but he leaves them behind. So why on earth does he do that? Is he just naive, or does he do it to give himself some psychological advantage in wanting to kill Macbeth? You know, does he, and I'm not saying this is a conscious idea, but does he unconsciously give Macbeth the opportunity to slaughter his family, which will then give Macduff the power to come back and kill Macbeth, the motivation to come back and kill him? If we want to be kind to him, we can see that he sacrifices his family for the greater good of Scotland. But if we want to be unkind to him, which I do, we can see this as the ultimate act of cowardice, where he shows no feeling towards the well-being of his own family and is actually much more in love with violence and death himself. But that, you must admit, is complicated. And then finally, the other complexity I want to give you is Banquo. Now, Banquo is, of course, a very noble character. He never acts badly on the witch's prophecies. He doesn't try to kill Macbeth, for example, in order for Fleance to become king. But what he does is fail to share the knowledge that he has. He knows that Macbeth has killed Duncan because he says so. I fear thou plays most foully for it. You know, he knows that that this has happened, but he doesn't go to the other nobles and say, look, I'm pretty certain that Macbeth has killed Duncan. Here is my evidence. We met the witches, etc., etc. He doesn't do that. He keeps utterly silent, and he's actually even prepared to enter into negotiations with Macbeth. You know, they meet on the night that he's killed to talk about sharing Macbeth's plans. You know, we will speak further on this business. So actually, Banquo could have prevented Macbeth becoming king, but he doesn't do that. Why? Well, because he needs Macbeth to become king in order to buy time for the witch's prophecy to come true about Fleance. Then Fleance will become king after Macbeth. The whole of the witch's prophecies won't work if Macbeth doesn't become king. So he needs that to happen. So he's actually potentially a bit corrupt here. And then we've got the added complexity that Banquo is the ancestor of King James II. So Shakespeare has to keep this negative side of Banquo very low key. You know, we have to infer that he's corrupt. Shakespeare isn't able to spell it out. So no character ever accuses Banquo of being duplicitous and manipulative in this way. So hopefully you've got some ideas there that will help you with any essay that you possibly get, how you can explore complicated ideas. Well, here's the next examiner's revelation. The better students wrote effectively about where the extract appeared within the text and could use this to explore character development. Now this is crucial. Many students write about the extract, but they don't think why that extract's important within the play as a whole. So let's look at two moments here. One, Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene. Why does it appear where it does? Well, it reveals that they sleep apart now that he's become king and she's become queen. So it tells us that becoming king and queen hasn't satisfied their desires. It's made their lives worse. And it also prepares the way for her suicide, which is going to happen just before the battle that he loses with Malcolm and Macduff. So we've got a reason for saying why that sleepwalking scene appears where it does. Similarly, let's look at Macbeth killing Banquo. This scene appears where it does because it leads to his madness. And it happens very soon after the killing of Duncan. And why? Because Shakespeare wants to juxtapose these two killings. Because the killing of Duncan stops him sleeping. It leads to psychological discomfort. It leads to feelings of guilt. But the killing of Banquo has much worse effects. The killing of Banquo leads him towards madness, We know that because he starts to see Banquo's ghost and no one else can see it. He starts hallucinating, and it also leads him to his bloodlust, where he says, he has that metaphor about wading into this river of blood, and he decides to just carry on slaughtering. And that all comes not after the killing of Duncan. So I am in blood stepped in so deep, it's the killing of Banquo that sends him that way. So hopefully this will help you write really intelligently about where the extract appears in the play. Let's look at a further example based on the sleepwalking scene. I've alluded to this already. The sleepwalking scene reveals Macbeth's great love for his wife, because it happens, look, on the morning of battle. He's going to fight for his life here, and it's possibly a battle that he realises he can't win, or you might argue he still believes in the witch's prophecies and thinks that, well, Birnam Wood isn't attacking me, it's not coming up the hill, therefore I'm still going to survive. But either way, this is a battle for his life, but he spends the morning of the battle getting ready to speak to the doctor, and he's brought the doctor in to see his wife. That shows a really powerful love, that he's placing his concern for her emotional and mental well-being ahead of his own desire to survive this battle. I find that absolutely extraordinary, and for me it's convincing proof that he deeply loves Lady Macbeth. Let's go back to the killing of Banquo. We can also infer from this that he's got a deep love of Banquo. He can't face killing him. He killed Duncan face to face with daggers. 2 daggers which he plunged directly into Duncan, even though he desperately didn't want to kill Duncan. He has all these moments when he's worrying about how wonderful Duncan is. He imagines the trumpet-tongued angels talking about how brilliant Duncan is. He knows he can't commit regicide because he's going against God, but he still goes through with it. However, the killing of Banquo, which is far less severe in terms of going against the divine right of kings, the killing of Banquo is much harder for Macbeth. And so he hires 2 killers to do it. He cannot do it himself. He can't face it. But more than that, this mysterious 3rd murderer appears, and we don't know why. Well, one reason could be showing how much Macbeth himself doesn't want to commit the murder himself. And so to distance himself even further from it, he gets a 3rd murderer to do it. And another way of looking at that is this shows how difficult he thinks it's going to be to kill Banquo for himself. And because he finds it so difficult to imagine killing Banquo, he sends 3 people to do it. That's how tough it is psychologically for him to betray his friend. And that implies a deep love of Banquo, which is really easy to miss. Okay, let's look at the next bit of examiner's advice. So, how does this evolve, and how the characters develop over the course of the play? So this is quite easy to do. If you write about the ending of the play, or the characters' ending in the play, you will always be able to show how they change. And how the characters change always shows how they develop. So this is a really easy way to get into the top bands. So we've already mentioned Macbeth's interruption of the battle to seek help for his wife. That is a clear development in him about caring for his wife. Something that we possibly haven't seen fully before. We could look at Macbeth's fear of death and Macduff. So at the end, he refuses to fight Macduff. I have too much blood of thine. My hands are too much charged with blood of thine already, he says. But this is also balanced against his desire to die. We can easily see at the end that he's seeking somebody out to kill him. Who was not born of woman? He goes around looking for the person who's not born of woman because he realises he can't possibly survive as king, or he realises it's simply a life not worth living. He's bought something, this kingship, which he now despises, and he's quite ready to die. And then the other possibility of character development is Macduff's moral cowardice which I told you about, abandoning his family, which is balanced by his desire for revenge, which is done for the good of Scotland. So all the characters will develop over the play, and it's really important to think that you've got to put that in your essay or you will not get in the top band. Right, then there comes a big plea from the examiners, and they do this every year, and they beg their students, or actually they beg their teachers, stop banging on about subject terminology because it leads to really bad answers. So let's have some quotes from the from the examiner's report. The language which allows a candidate to write clearly and fluently about the text, that's what subject terminology means. So it isn't about spotting language features, it's just about naming things when you need to, when you're actually writing about why those things appear in the text. And the subject terminology itself doesn't get you any marks, it's only when it's linked to your thoughtful ideas. And so it's the ideas that are going to get the marks, and you only need the terminology to describe those ideas. Now here's a big plea, and I hate this as well. When I see this in students' essays, it drives me nuts. So, identifying verbs or nouns in the extracts rarely led to particularly fruitful analysis. So this is powerful because it means if you think that terminology is just talking about whether it's a noun or a verb, you're missing the point. That doesn't lead you to any thoughtful ideas. So ditch it. You don't need to be talking about that stuff. And the other reason you don't need to is this situation was exacerbated when such terms were used incorrectly. So frequently, students will call an adverb a verb or a noun an adjective or so on. They'll just get the terminology wrong. So if you are going to use subject terminology, make sure you're 100% certain it's right. Otherwise, you will genuinely lose marks. It's not in the mark scheme that you'll have marks taken away, but it's in the examiner's head because you'll just sound like someone who doesn't know the very basics about English language and literature, and they'll just want to mark you down. It's human nature. Okay, next comes some really good advice about the context. So context needs to come out of particular details in the play. So don't tell me about King James II and his relationship with Shakespeare unless it's relevant to the particular detail that you're talking about. So where it's relevant to the witches, then you're going to discuss it, but you're not just going to chuck it in as a separate paragraph. And that's what too many students do. They just add the context into the essay at random, don't make it relevant to the question. Right, let's have a look at some context that will always be relevant. So, does Macbeth show that there is no such thing as supernatural power and therefore ridicule King James's belief in witchcraft? So we can look at the fact that the witches don't tell Macbeth to do anything at all, and yet he goes out and chooses to believe their prophecies. He chooses to decide that the only way to become king is to murder Duncan. But the witches don't do that at all. You know, they could just be three old women meeting Macbeth, having a bit of a laugh. I mean, I'm not saying that it's funny, but you know, their level of power is zero. They can't make Macbeth do anything. And King James believed that real witches tried to sink his ship off the coast of Scotland by raising a storm. And you can see that Shakespeare doesn't create supernatural witches who have this kind of power over the elements, over the weather, who can kill the king themselves. He's much more subtle than that. So we can read the witches as poking fun at King James. You remember he's written his book about witchcraft called Demonology. It's in my other videos. I'll link it up here somewhere. Or the other alternative is no, he's not mocking King James at all. Instead, he's trying to flatter King James by saying, yes, witchcraft is real. Yes, they can affect people's minds. They are very subtle and cunning. Look what they do to Macbeth to turn him from a nobleman into a murderer, and moreover, one who's going to kill the king, commit regicide. And Shakespeare's motivation for this is to make the king his patron, which means that he will succeed financially. So you can interpret it both ways, but simply chucking in some context that King James believed in witches isn't good enough. You have to make it relevant to why Shakespeare writes about these witches in the way he does. I hope I've shown you how that works. Right, next, another bit of context is always going to be about the patriarchy. So here we've got Lady Macbeth. Is she a misogynistic portrayal? So misogynistic means anti-woman. So is Shakespeare writing this character, Lady Macbeth, to be a horrible, scheming woman because that's how women were seen at the time? They were considered capable of using their sexuality to corrupt men, to stop them being good people. This comes from the story of Adam and Eve. So you've got these two innocent creatures. Satan in the form of the serpent comes to Eve and says, look, why don't you eat the fruit that's forbidden from the tree of knowledge of good and evil? She does, and then she's the one who persuades Adam to do it. Now this is an exact parallel of Lady Macbeth persuading Macbeth to kill Duncan. You can read it that way. So is Shakespeare offering a portrayal that is misogynistic against women, which is typical of the time? And that's even more political now because the greatest woman of the time, Queen Elizabeth I, has just died and been replaced by King James. And so you can see this as the natural order being restored. Oh good, we've got a male king on the throne again rather than a woman. Everything's going to be all right now. You know, there's that misogynistic possibility. Or is her tragedy that she lives in a patriarchal society? This means a society controlled by men for men. So Shakespeare could be saying, look, it's really easy to see Lady Macbeth as evil and the one who destroys Macbeth's morality, destroys his sanity by getting him to kill Duncan. But actually, Shakespeare could be asking a deeper question. If we only value a woman by her social status as a wife, then her only possibility to do well in life is to marry well, and her only way of becoming better is to get a husband to have a higher position in society. So by denying women their identity, are we forcing them into this role where they have to try and get power through controlling their husbands? In other words, does the patriarchal society create Lady Macbeth? Does it force her to become evil and manipulative? And in a better society where women were able to succeed by themselves, perhaps their inherent goodness would come out more. So perhaps when Shakespeare writes his character Lady Macbeth, he wants to point out that it's not just her fault. Society has made her this way. So you can see there are two differing interpretations, opposite interpretations of Lady Macbeth, and it's very easy then to bring in the historical context about how women were judged. If, however, you say the role of women in Shakespeare's time was to look after the household, the examiner will just say, no, you've missed the point, you're an idiot. Okay, so you want to think about the political context and what Shakespeare is trying to change in society, or what he's trying to agree with in society, which was the Christian illusion of Genesis, the story in Adam and Eve that I spoke to you about earlier. So I hope that really helps you explore context in lots of detail. Well, the next bit of advice is that you need to interpret themes. And to get the top marks, you need to consider more than one interpretation. Well, I hope you can see how I've structured each of these slides that I've given you as having more than one interpretation all the way through. That's why you've got the black and then the purple. And I've done that throughout this video to prepare you so that you're already doing that. You're already prepared to offer more than one interpretation. Let's dip into some themes and see how that would work. So the most common theme is ambition. I think that was the theme of last year's question, so it may not come up in 2018, but we'll see. So you can look at how it ruins the lives of Lady Macbeth and Banquo, but you want a separate interpretation. So you could contrast it with how ambition helps Malcolm, because his ambition is to come back and become a good king, not just a king, but a much better king than Macbeth. Or you could look at the ambition that brings Fleance back as king, so Banquo sacrificing his own life to save his son, knowing that Fleance would then come and become king. Whether he expects him to become a good king, we don't know. However, politically, it was accepted that Fleance would become a good king because he is the ancestor of King James II. And Shakespeare's audience would have known that the innocent Fleance was therefore a good role model who would be a wonderful ancestor to the wonderful James II. Well, that's the political point that Shakespeare's making. Okay, what if the theme is love? Well, here we can contrast Lady Macbeth's love for her husband, where she's willing to risk everything in order to make him king, to Lady Macduff's love for her husband, where she's actually in despair of him and criticises him very openly to her young son and calls him a traitor and a coward. Lady Macbeth calls her husband a coward, but she doesn't actually believe that. It's a way to manipulate him. And then, of course, we can look at Macbeth's loves for Lady Macbeth, which we've talked about a lot in this video, and also Macduff's love for his wife, which we've seen is secondary to his love for his country, and he sacrifices her life in order to give him the power to come back and fight for Scotland. So it's very easy to look at the contrast if you force yourself to think that way. The theme is very likely to be the supernatural. That's my top tip for the 2018 exam question. And here we can contrast the power of the witches on stage. So you can look at how they appear on their own on stage, the kind of language they're given when they do their spells, the horrible imagery, the fact that they can see into the future, it appears. And then you can contrast that with the fact that they never tell anyone to act in any way, and they never control the future. An easy example is if they're seeing the future where Macbeth can become king, that could just be happening 20 years from now when Duncan dies a natural death, and Macbeth might just be the next in line by then. The fact that Duncan has said Malcolm is going to follow him, well, that's not inevitable, is it? Malcolm could die in battle, he could die of disease, etc., etc. So the witches might be able to see into the future, but their ability might not be in terms of having evil powers. They've just got evil intentions, so they manipulate Macbeth to believe that he has to act in certain ways, but they never even tell him to act. They never say kill the king. They never say kill Banquo. They never tell him to do anything that's wrong. So that's a way of looking at more than one interpretation of the supernatural in the play. Another top theme is appearance and reality. I think this is a sort of a cheat theme because every time you look at these contrasting interpretations, you can argue, well, one, it is the appearance, but actually if I look at this the other way, here is my reality. So this theme of appearance and reality can relate to all of them, to ambition, to the supernatural, to love. Yeah, it's a kind of overarching theme. So here we could contrast the power of the witches on stage. Oh no, hold on. Yes, sorry, that's it. That was the point I was making with this slide. You can just say, right, I'm just going to talk about the supernatural. Appearance and reality, supernatural, exactly the same thing. I'll use the same evidence. I thought I'd made a mistake there for a minute. And now to the last theme. You may well get about the theme of kingship. And this is a really good theme to get because it forces you to write about the context of the time and make it relevant. You're going to write about King James II. I'll put a link here to my video on on this theme. In fact, I've got some brilliant videos on the themes, which are guaranteed to get you grade 8 and 9. But enough waffle about that. You just want one thing to focus on. So you can contrast the nobility of Duncan. So he is a great king. Everybody thinks he's a wonderful person. There's plenty of evidence in the play, in even the way Macbeth describes him, as meek and mild and noble. But you can contrast that with his naivety as a ruler, because he's missed that both Thanes of Cawdor are traitor. So the original one who helped the Norwegians, and then Macbeth becomes the Thane of Cawdor, and then he's a traitor. And so Shakespeare could be arguing that, you know, actually we don't want kings who are just nice guys. We want kings who are politically astute and can read the nobles beneath them. They can read the laws, they can read the Thanes, and they understand who's plotting against them. If Duncan were a better king, Norway wouldn't have invaded. They would have known there wasn't any chance. But because Duncan was such a poor judge of human character, he failed to notice that the Norwegians had an inside man, which meant that Duncan could be attacked on two fronts. One from the sea, with the invasion of the Norwegians, one from the land with the Thane of Cawdor. So, I hope you can see how it's really easy to write about more than one interpretation. Now, I'm pretty pleased with this video because I reckon you could answer just about any single question on Macbeth having watched this video, and you'd have enough in it to get at least into a grade 7. If you would like to get into grades 8 and 9 for each of those themes, follow the links that I've given you. So, thank you for subscribing. If you haven't, do it now, and I look forward to helping you again on my channel so you can get the top grades.